Hello, everyone, and welcome to Klara's webinar, Enterprise Security, Deploying Two-Factor Authentication for SSH on FreeBSD. I'm your host today, Allan Jude, and joining me is Michael W. Lucas, noted author and technical expert on SSH.
Hi, Allan. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks for joining us. So just as a brief summary of what we're going to cover today, we'll talk about some of the prerequisites, things you need to know to be able to understand what we're talking about, including, what is two-factor authentication and why might you want to use it, and then what some of your options are, how to select the right option for your use case, and then how to actually implement multi-factor authentication. So to get us started, before you go and configure multi-factor authentication on your system, you first want to make sure that your SSH is already configured securely.
Very, very much so. It does you very little good to have two-factor authentication, but then let root log into your system, because then you will have all kinds of people trying to log in there.
Yeah, it's kind of like the popular meme of the fence that covers the path and the very obvious track marks of people just going around the fence and continuing down the path.
Yes, yes. And definitely take a look at the ciphers you're using and how you're configured. FreeBSD's OpenSSH daemon is generally fairly reasonable, but things happen. And pointing a tool like SSH audit at your server can help double check your configuration and catch things that you may have missed.
Yeah, so like we have here, one of the things you want to do is look at using authentication with keys more than passwords, because passwords have a lot of problems, which we'll talk about later in the talk. And like Michael mentioned, you don't want to allow root login. So you want to completely disable login as the root user over SSH, have people log in as individual users, not just because it's bad to log in as root, but you also want your logs to show which user logged in and then switch to root rather than just somebody logged in as root. So having that extra step there provides more security, but it also means that you have a better audit trail.
Yes, it's important to know who broke things.
Yes. And so you want to make sure you're not supporting any of the legacy versions of SSH, SSH v1 or old ciphers or old key types that you shouldn't be using anymore. And that's where that SSH audit website can scan your SSH server and make sure that you're not exposing anything you shouldn't be. But I know, Michael, you also wanted to touch on, that we're long past the days when you could have security through obscurity by just changing the port number you ran SSH on.
Yeah, years ago, I set up my SSH on an alternate port, and the scanners have found it. I wound up dealing with that by turning off the daily email I turned off the part of the daily email that reports on failed SSH logins. And
Because
instead, I just
otherwise your
report
email
on
is just full.
successful. Yeah, that's not actionable material. And the smart SSH scanners will see that you only allow key-based authentication and stop trying.
Yeah, you can't assume all of the people trying to brute force your network are that smart, but the more people you get to go away, the less resources they're wasting on your systems.
Yes. So cloud computing is so cheap now, they can brute force through port knocking. They hit your odd ports. Set it so you're not told about it and get on with your life.
Yeah. because in particular, there are now even basically search engines for port scans, so that not everybody has to scan the whole internet themselves. And so once one scanner has found that you're running SSH on, port 9237, then everybody actually knows about that now, and you've not accomplished anything.
Yes. Oh, and we have a comment from Bruce Control that FreeBSD has an SSH audit package.
Yeah. So if you don't want to use that website, or for example, the machine you want to test is inside your network and not exposed to the public, then yeah, you can install the SSH audit package from FreeBSD's package repository. The current version is py38-ssh-audit. Thank you for that. So the other prerequisite we need to talk about is PAM.
PAM. Pluggable authentication modules. It's the standard for configuring authentication on most Unixes. And it is a pure delight of tangled options. Now, the idea of being able to use shared libraries to configure authentication seems great, but not only is the rule order vital, the rules build an access control list that is unlike any other Unix ACL. If you look at say pf.conf, you say allow this, allow block, etc. PAM lets you write rules that say, well, I'll allow it if this other module agrees. Or I'll allow this, but twice. Or I won't allow this unless it's Tuesday.
I think there's even an option of if this one doesn't work, that's okay, as long as some other one does.
Yes. And we're actually, that sounds horrid, but we're going to use that today. So the nice thing about PAM is that vendors provide PAM modules for their stuff. And that makes implementing much of this pretty similar.
Yeah, so it works about the same on a bunch of different systems. So lastly, we want to talk about what two-factor or multi-factor authentication actually means. So the most basic principle here of two-factor authentication is that you need two different factors or types of things in order to log in. So instead of just knowing your password, you also have to have a security token that generates a key, or you have to scan a fingerprint or a facial recognition or something like that. So it's requiring at least two of these different types of authentication. Something you know, like a password, or the answer to a secret question, or anything else you might know, or something you have, like a security token or an app on your phone that does authentication, or it can even be a pre-generated list of keys on a piece of paper, like the recovery keys you might have for some types of two-factor authentication. So just something that you physically have. Big note that Michael likes to point out here is that the SSH keys you have are not something you have. They are really more something you know. They're not a physical thing.
They're so easy to replicate. It's using an authentication key is great and it's delightful, but as far as 2FA goes, it's really like 1.2 factor authentication.
Yeah, because it's generally a file that lives on your disk. Maybe it's encrypted with a password, but then it mostly comes down to that's just a second password. And two things you know isn't as strong as something you know and something you have, or something you know and something you are.
And
then
some of these are more complicated than you might think. I mean, Allan, when's the last time you changed your eyeballs?
And it's been a while.
It's been a while and it's kind of difficult. So biometrics look really cool. But if that pattern was to be leaked, you're kind of out of luck.
Yeah, like I remember back in the day watching the Mythbusters defeating a bunch of different fingerprint scanners, including the one I used for my computer. Uh,
Yes.
the one I had was the hardest of the ones they had to defeat, but they still defeated it with like a sheet of acetate and pulling fingerprints off a CD jewel case.
Yes. Yes. So it sounds cool. It really does. But even when we get DNA-based authentication tools, we leave DNA everywhere. So something you have that is large enough you can actually keep track of it really is a better option.
Yeah,
And
and
so we're going to use something you know and something you have today.
right, and we're even usually kind of combining that where you're to access the authenticator app on your phone, maybe it is using your fingerprint or facial recognition before it will unlock and give you access to the something you have.
Yep.
But that's not really a third factor because that's not being verified by the server. But it does get to our other point, which is defense in depth. The more layers you have, the harder it is for someone to find a hole that happens to lead through all of them.
Right. The trick with authentication is there's a difference between someone looking for a server to break into and someone trying to break into your personal stuff, whether it's actually personal or for work. If it's just someone looking for a victim, two-factor authentication makes them go away and pick on someone else. If they're really going after someone personally, I mean, if someone wanted to break into Allan's accounts, well, with two-factor authentication, you might have to, say, break into his home or dig through his trash, and it really raises the amount of work they have to do.
Yeah.
So really what we're trying to do is just make it difficult so they give up and go away.
Yeah. And passwords don't do that. Passwords
No.
are often weak. They often get reused or follow a pattern, and they tend to get leaked online. And that's especially where that reuse can become a problem because they know, oh, someone with this email address has used this password on 3 different sites. I bet they're also using it on this 4th one that hasn't been compromised yet, but I'm going to get into that account now.
Yep.
Or, especially places that follow outdated security practices of making you change your password every 30 or 90 days or something to that effect.
Oh,
So many people end up using like a base password and just rotating the last couple of characters or digits or something. And that results in weaker passwords. And that's why you're seeing more and more services wanting to do two-factor authentication or even trying to replace the password entirely with, oh, when you want to log in, we'll send you a one-time token to let you log in via your email or whatever, rather than having to use a password. And I guess that gets to a question Alexander just asked. Can't you do away with passwords entirely? And yes, one of the things we're talking about here is you could use an SSH key, which should have a password, but that password's local, not on the server. And then using the second factor with the token to authenticate. And so you have a key, which is something you know, and the token, which is something you have. And that way you don't need to use password as one of the factors at all. And that is much stronger. And it gives you, again, that defense in depth we're trying to build. If you kind of picture
right.
the common thing of layers of Swiss cheese, you just want to make sure there's not one hole that goes all the way through. And so when any one layer has a hole in it, it's up to the other layers to stop it. And that's why we want to have a bunch of layers to make sure that we filter all these things out. So we have only accepting strong SSH, we have not allowing root login, and then we have not allowing passwords and requiring strong keys and requiring a second factor.
And Phil has asked a question about commenting on SMS, and you'll hear people say that SMS is not secure. And that is true, but it comes down to a question of who is attacking you. If someone could set up a fake cell tower and intercept your phone and capture your SMS before it reaches you, that's entirely possible. That's also a lot of work. Is someone going to do that to break into Allan's network? I don't think so. I don't think he has anything that valuable. And if he did, he wouldn't tell us. But if you're using it to get into your bank and pay your bills, chances are you are fine.
Yeah.
If
Although the more common attack for SMS is actually someone social engineering your phone company and porting your phone number to their phone so that they get the
oh
SMS instead of
yes,
you. And that
that
has
definitely
happened
happens too.
alarmingly frequently.
So how much trouble are you worth? Personally, I'm worthless. So I have a different threat profile than Allan, and I have a different threat profile than some of you out there.
But yeah, I would say SMS is not a great second factor, but it's better than no second factor.
Yes.
And that's it kind of gets to another value you get from 2FA, especially the more active types like the SMS or the app-based push notification, is that just when someone attempts to log in as you, if your phone says, hey, someone's trying to log in as you, is that you? That's an alert that you wouldn't normally easily get otherwise. And so once they've passed one factor, you have this opportunity to break the chain that they're using to get through your defense in depth.
So, yeah. And I think the last thing here, regulatory requirements. If you're in a business that's regulated and the government regulation says you will use 2FA, well, you're going to use 2FA.
Yeah, and then part of what we're going to talk about today is picking the right kind specifically to avoid the next problem we're going to talk about, which is MFA fatigue. Security is always a sliding scale. As you turn towards more and more secure, it gets more and more inconvenient and hard for the user. And at some point, the trade-offs aren't worth it anymore, and you have to find the right point along that spectrum that makes sense for your users. Because security threats can come from both inside or outside your organization, and defense in depth with multiple layers of security is your best posture to protect your infrastructure.
Yeah, it's certainly possible to go overboard. You could build the example we're going to use and require Google Authenticator, a YubiKey, and Duo, and an SSH key. And at that point, you'll have your sysadmins mobbing your office with torches and pitchforks.
Yeah, because we've definitely seen a trend recently of more of this MFA fatigue where, having to have too many extra prompts or extra steps or just things that break the flow when a user's trying to do something. And that causes them to try to push back and have fewer of these options or have an option like, oh, when I'm coming from my trusted device, don't ask for the second factor all the time. And finding that right trade-off can be important for your organization to have a successful 2FA deployment. But as part of that, you must develop good procedures to ensure that your MFA recovery mechanism doesn't actually become the weak point in your enterprise security. Oftentimes what we see is that, a company will have 2FA and it'll be a strong way to protect them. But then if someone's calls up and claims they're a certain person and, they've lost their phone, then they can just disable 2FA temporarily or reset it up on some other device without actually authenticating that it was the correct person first. And if that process can be exploited or socially engineered, then it can become the weak point in your security. And now the two-factor has not made things better for you.
Yep. Basically, you have to sit down and think, if I was a jerk, how would I abuse this?
So now we're going to talk about, Michael briefly touched on it, but some of the options you have for two-factor authentication. So the first is to use an authenticator app like Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator, uh, which is basically something that you can just install on your mobile device or other thing and have as a way to provide that second factor. Another option is a physical token like a YubiKey or other similar devices. And these provide secure storage for something like the SSH key and provide some other way to authenticate that you have this token and proof that you have this second factor. An interesting one is Duo, which is now from Cisco, which is basically a push notification to your phone that just says somebody's trying to log in as you on this device or service. Do you want to allow or deny it? And that can be a lower friction type of 2FA, since unlike the Google Authenticator, where you have to type in a code that keeps changing in order to prove that you have the token, the Duo just requires you to hit approve on your device, which could even be your watch and can be more convenient, but does have the downside of requiring both the server and the client to have active internet connections for the push notification to work, whereas the Google Authenticator can happen completely offline. And then we'll also talk a bit about Fido or U2F, which is a new up and coming standard that's more universal so that you're not locked in with a specific vendor like a YubiKey.
And we'll be focusing on Google Authenticator later in this talk, simply because you can start using that without spending any money. And the trick to configuring 2FA with PAM, with SSH, is configuring PAM. So once you have a grip on the PAM configuration, doing a different module in PAM, you'll want to read the documentation and maybe add another flag or two, but generally it works the same.
So now we already briefly touched on it, but helping you choose what some of those options are. Like we said, the Google Authenticator is free, but you have to type in this 6-digit code every time you want to log in. The YubiKey has the advantage of a physical token that you plug into your machine and press a button on it. But it also means you have to buy all these physical tokens, and it can be more of a pain if you lose or break the token. Or something like Duo, which sends the alert to your device, but that requires connectivity on both the server and the client, which for air-gapped systems might not be allowed, and again is a vendor-specific solution that will cost more money. So you kind of have to choose your annoyance. The advantage with Google and YubiKey again is that they can work offline and air-gapped, but Duo does scale to a large number of users and devices much more easily.
And you want to be sure that you provision enough equipment to meet the actual need. I was at one company consulting where they didn't have enough RSA tokens to go around. So they pointed a webcam at one. And if you knew the website, you could get the current token and use the shared account. This did not end well. So buy more tokens than you think you need, because you will need them.
Yep. D. McGrath was asking about if your device is offline and your clocks aren't in sync, would time-based tokens be a pain? We'll get to that in a minute. And that again comes back sometimes to your recovery methods of how are you going to be able to deal with when your token doesn't work because clocks aren't in sync, or your counters are out of whack, or somebody loses their phone, or whatever it is. I had a recent adventure during my travels where I'd left my cell phone on the airplane, and it took some time to get it back. But if I hadn't, I would have been in kind of a world of hurt as far as 2FA. And you want to make sure that you have mechanisms in place to deal with that.
And we have a question on from Matthias. Would we recommend a particular YubiKey? And well, I bought mine a few years ago. I have no idea what the current models are. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't have a specific recommendation for a YubiKey model. Sorry. And then Brian asks, wouldn't the bad guys just start spamming dual auth requests and do kind of a denial of service until you say yes? That depends. Generally, what you want there is you don't get the duo request until you've already authenticated with the first factor. So you've already entered a password or some other something before it sends the request. So, if they are at that point spamming your duo trying to get in, then that's an indication to you that they've compromised your first factor and you need to rotate it. So you change the password or whatever the something is, and then they can't get to the duo step.
And you also need training here of the users that if they start getting spammed, they have to open a ticket. Presumably you have a help desk available if you have this many users, and someone can, if nothing else, lock that account until the next morning when someone can deal with it.
Yeah.
Or hopefully you have your 24/7 security team on site at all times. But otherwise, lock them out.
Yeah. So now we'll talk a bit about actually implementing Google Authenticator. So Google Authenticator is software distributed by Google. It doesn't require access to Google or being online at all, but it allows you to transform a device like your cell phone or smartwatch into an authentication token, like one of those RSA tokens that Michael mentioned a minute ago. So once you authenticate, it will print out a 6-digit passcode, depending on the type you've set up. And that will allow you to use that as the second factor. So after you log in with your username and password or whatever your first factor is, it will prompt you for that second factor. And you have to, go to your phone, get the 6-digit code and type it in order to be able to log in. And, any or all of your devices can be this type of token. One of the advantages here is you can have, more than one device have your token, so that in the case of your phone breaks or, gets wet or lost or just won't take a charge or whatever happens to your phone, you have another device that you can use to authenticate in the meantime, or some other fallback mechanism. And again, like we mentioned early on, you want to make sure that you have some kind of security on the device as well, because, if your phone can be stolen, you don't want it to be giving these codes out to other people. Require your unlock code or your fingerprint scan or something to, again, try to lock down that token so that it won't give out codes to just anyone.
So when you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, when you look at Google Authenticator, this is a standard, by the way. There's an RFC we mentioned later in the talk. Every host has a unique shared secret. And then the user must log on to every host that they want to authenticate to and configure Google Authenticator for that. And you want your clocks to match. And there's a couple of FreeBSD packages to set up Google Authenticator. The PAM Google Authenticator is mandatory. The libqr encode is not mandatory unless you're a regular human being who wants to actually use this software.
Yeah, that allows you to get the configuration from the server as a QR code instead of, a bunch of manual information you're going to have to enter into all your devices. It's so much easier to just scan the QR code.
Yes.
So as we mentioned, there are two main types of this two-factor authentication with the Google Authenticator app. The first one is the hashed one-time passwords, which are basically counter-based. So it's a series of one-time codes based on a counter, and the server and the client each have the same counter, and the server will increment it when you try to log in and be like, hey, I need this counter code. And using that shared secret, it'll generate the next hash and give you that 6-digit password. So this relies on that counter being shared between the user and the server, but it requires that you don't get those out of sync, such as the user, butt dialing the authenticator and continuing to get it out of whack. And there are fallback mechanisms you can configure for that, like if your counters do get out of whack, you can configure the app to require 3 sequential one-time codes to prove that you have the device and not that you've just stolen it. But one of the advantages of a counter-based system is you can pre-generate the codes. So you can actually have, the next 200 codes printed out on a physical piece of paper or something, which can be a useful fallback mechanism when things go sideways. Whereas the time-based ones require an accurate clock. So instead of a counter, they use the timestamp, usually modulus some number of seconds, like 30 to 60 seconds. But that means that both the authentication device and the server need to agree on what time it is within a reasonable amount of time. And you also have the window of how long it takes the user to type in those codes.
Yeah, there's usually a little bit of slop, but in the time allowance, but not as much as you would hope for.
It is somewhat configurable, and we talk a bit about that in the upcoming slides. So on the device, you can see a little screenshot here of what it generally looks like. And it'll just have, the different accounts you might have and their current codes, and those all get printed out after you authenticate. But there are also alternatives to Google if you want. There's different plugins and so on to be able to have access to those codes.
So yeah, when you log in and you want to configure Google Authenticator for your account, run the program Google Authenticator, and it asks first off if you want your tokens to be time-based. I almost always recommend time-based, just because I've seen too many people butt dial 100 counter-based tokens. It seems to be easier than you would think to mess up that counter.
Yeah.
The catch is when you get the barcode, when you get the QR code that has your secret in it, copy that, save it. You will never see it again. And the next time you configure a device, say you buy a new phone, or you want it on a tablet, you need that secret.
Yeah, but you also need to keep that secret safe, because otherwise anyone else who has it now has a device that can generate the same time-based codes for you. And now they can log into your account.
Yep, I generally save it to a file, print it, and get rid of the file.
Yep.
And there's a few options that you can add. If you're running this in a large environment, the administrator can answer these for you beforehand. The first one says, can you reuse the tokens? Yes or no? It seems like disallowing token reuse would be a good idea, but I know when I'm troubleshooting a problem, almost always the first thing I do is open 3 or 4 terminal windows into the server. And if I can only open a new terminal every 30 seconds, it's vastly annoying. So that's a case of choosing your pain. The second question lets you adjust the time slot to give you a couple extra minutes to use codes. And finally, there's rate limiting, which rate limiting usually works because if you enter your passcode wrong and enter it wrong again, and then you enter it wrong on the 3rd time and trigger the rate limiting, maybe you shouldn't be logging onto the server right now anyway. Take a deep breath, try again in a moment.
Yeah, just do consider the potential for the, second level denial of service attack, where someone's purposely brute forcing your account, not to try to get in, but just to make sure that you can't get in.
Yep.
And we have another question from the attendees asking, don't some printer queues these days, especially cloud-based ones, potentially save your printed jobs, thus making printing your QR code potentially risky? That is a risk. It depends on, how your printer's connected and configured, and
Yes.
what your kind of attack model is, or your threat model.
I was not aware that cloud-based printer queues were a thing. And thank you, I'm now completely horrified.
Wow. Everybody should be horrified about everything to do with printers.
Yes. But printers and cloud together, oh. No.
Yeah. Well, how else are you going to print from
Oh.
your phone?
Oh, it's a pain.
Yeah.
Okay, that's my moment of despair. Let's talk about configuring PAM. If you look in Etsy pam.d, you'll find a bunch of configuration files, each named after the service. And so this is snipped out of Etsy pam.d SSHD. And there are 4 kinds of rules. The important kind of rules for us right now are auth rules for authentication. And at the end of the list of auth rules, you'll see a line that says auth required pamunix.so, and then a couple of options for it. The important thing here is that a required rule means you must satisfy this library. And the library here, pamunix, is basically Etsy password. You've got to have a correct password to get in. So I've added another option, another rule here. It's another authentication required rule for the PAM Google module. And I've added the null OK option, because what that does is if your user has not yet configured Google Authenticator, they can log in and configure it, and then it will be required.
Yeah, the null
So
OK basically says this module can say, no, you can't log in, or yes, you can log in. And it also can say, I don't have an opinion.
Yes. So in theory, what you do is you leave null OK in there for a week or 2 and let everybody log in and configure their Google Authenticator access. And then you remove the null OK. And in theory, everybody has it configured. And that turns into your first warning where users who didn't configure it on time can't log in, and you get to yell at them. You might also set up some scripting so that a user who doesn't have Google Authenticator gets dumped into the configuration program when they log in.
And then Albert asks, what's your opinion on using more than one possible second factor to get around problems like my hardware token is broken, or I lost my phone, or forgot to copy the authentication stuff over when I was, wiping the old one or transferring it to the new one?
You certainly can. You might say, use my YubiKey, but fall back to Google Authenticator. And there are examples in the PAM book on how to do that.
And we'll mention that again at the end, because if you're getting into this, you probably are going to want to take a look at the SSH and PAM books. So lastly, before we're out of time, I just wanted to quickly touch on Fido and U2F. So Fido works a bit differently, partly that it's built into SSH itself, and uses two new key types, either ECDSA-secure key or ED25519 secure key. This is much more self-service for the end user rather than being something that's set up by the administrator. It just allows them to configure their authorized keys to, be this key that requires part of it from the Fido token. And it also can work with SSH certificates, which, if you're dealing with a large number of users, is probably a better way to configure this than each user generating their own keys and you trying to enroll all those. One of the big advantages with Fido/U2F is that it's a standard. So it's supposed to work with any token device that supports the standard, rather than specifically having to buy UB branded keys or whatever. Fido version 2 also supports what's called resident keys, where the private key file, which normally would be a file on your disk in your home directory, is actually resident on the token as well as the HSM part, so that if you're switching machines a lot, moving between different laptops or desktops, having the key live on your token, so that you just have to have your token and then you have access to your key as well, can make it a very useful way to have two-factor that's more universal, and also to use the same two-factor for things like websites that are building in U2F as well. And then Alexander asks about YubiKeys supporting Fido2. And yes, the newer YubiKeys do support Fido2 and have support for all of this. But it just means they're not the only option anymore. Okay, were there any more questions? While we wait for that, if you would like help setting up your enterprise security and setting up two-factor for your servers, then please reach out to us. The team at Klara Systems are experts in FreeBSD and open infrastructure, and will help you build out a secure authentication system with all the recovery steps and everything that you need to know. And if you enjoyed the webinar, make sure to follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn to get notifications about future webinars. And then, as we mentioned, Michael also has books you can buy on these specific topics. Want to tell us a bit more about that, Michael?
Well, ebook and print in just about every bookstore. You can find links on my website, along with last count 47 other books. It may be said that I have a problem, but I'm told that these are helpful. and they're short enough to be reasonably readable by a busy sysadmin.
Yes, and they also add a bit of levity and make it fun to read. So yeah, if you've ever wondered what some of those more exotic configurations you can do with SSH are, then definitely check out the SSH Mastery Book. And PAM is not for the faint of heart. So having a companion to go through it with you is super helpful.
I've been told that the most useful thing about the PAM book is that it's very reassuring in that it's not you. This standard really is somewhat deranged. And the truth is, it's not even really a standard. We use it, but the specification we all use is actually a draft that was never approved.
Yeah, and it just happens to be what everybody uses because it's the only option. And so
Yes.
it's kind of de facto become the thing. But yeah, it was never actually ratified as a standard.
So here we are.
Someone
But
from the chat room. Oh, go ahead.
Once you tangle with it, it's not terrible. It's not as terrible as you think.
Yeah. And someone from the chat room points out that they're using YubiKey to store their SSH keys currently and find it sometimes to be a pain on non-Unix systems to get access to the key. And they recommend, if you are going to buy a YubiKey, get one of the ones that supports the 4000-bit keys and not the ones that only support 2048-bit RSA, because you really want to have 4K keys nowadays.
The good news is 4K keys will last beyond the career of anyone currently on this call.
I don't know about that. I remember when I first entered my first 4K key, and it took like 2.5 seconds to log in every time on my 1 gigahertz machine.
Yep, but cracking those is going to take with current computing, it's beyond the heat death of the universe.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We've got maybe another couple of seconds for questions, and then that's it. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Allan.
Thank you again for helping with this, Michael.
My pleasure.